Well, hello to all of my methodical researchers out there. Welcome to the Week 4 assignment tutorial. Now, this assignment focuses on the basics of preliminary analysis, as well as on some related topics like using treatises and using legal encyclopedias. Now, as always, I'm going to go ahead and recommend that you carefully read over the whole problem a few times first. Our fact pattern here has Juanita getting ready to make the move to the ATL for an exciting new job. And of course, what does she need? An apartment. She sees this ad that offers what seems like a once-in-a-lifetime deal, $500 off rent for her first year. She checks it out and falls in love with this penthouse apartment, signs the lease right on the spot. However, it turns out that the $500 off deal just doesn't apply to her apartment because it's in the penthouse, of course. Now, the apartment company, Peachtree Partners, they do offer to give her that promotion, but only if she'll move to that first floor apartment, and she doesn't want to do that. So your supervising attorney asks you to research whether the Peachtree Partners might have actually committed the tort of fraud on Juanita. So just like last time, we start out just by doing some basic planning. Question 1 wants the legal issue. And just like last time, this is a pretty straightforward one because it's essentially included in the problem itself. We want to know whether Peachtree Partners or its agent committed the tort of fraud. And well, you might look at these facts, maybe see some other theories, especially perhaps some theories associated with maybe contracts, but the partner just doesn't want you to research any of those. Your colleagues are hard at work on that. Instead, the partner has specifically asked you to research this potential fraud claim. Question 2 is also relatively uneventful. Again, we're just going to find the answer in the problem itself. We are in the state of Georgia. However, just because this is straightforward, like the question about the issue, it doesn't mean that it's unimportant. You really do need to make a point of consciously thinking about all of these different aspects of planning, including the issue, including jurisdiction, even as sometimes they might seem a little basic. Why? Well, the basic reason is that they just won't always be that basic. You don't want to miss something important if the question of jurisdiction is maybe something that's a little more complex and difficult to figure out. So on to question 3. We're just identifying the key facts, and I'm not going to recite them all in this video since I just talked about the fact pattern, and I want to be as brief as possible, but you can find some possible answers here in the answer key. And basically, I'm just going into the fact pattern. I'm pulling out the most salient facts in these little chunks, and the idea is to make these facts more manageable so that as we learn more about the law, we can start to evaluate and categorize them. And this may seem kind of mysterious right now, but it'll become more important and clearer as we get further into cases in that 4th step of our process. And it really helps us to start thinking about the facts at this early point to prepare for that. Now, question 4, we're digging a little bit deeper. Question 4 wants you to give 2 secondary sources that would help you get an overview of the law here. And it shouldn't come as a huge surprise that it specifically wants you to find both a legal encyclopedia and a treatise, since these are the 2 sources that we use for preliminary analysis most often. And keep in mind that this is basically what you're going to need to do on the midterm to get full credit as well. So for the legal encyclopedia, we're researching Georgia law. So we know that it's got to be Georgia jurisprudence. And since we know the name of that source already, we'll just start typing the name in here. And voila, it auto-populates. And we can just click on it. And we know that we want the tort of fraud as opposed to like criminal fraud or something like that. So we'll go ahead right off the bat and just limit this to our title on personal injury and torts. And we'll just search for fraud and see what we get. And our results here, at least our first few results, are just not great. This first result, it's titled fraud, so that's a good sign. But our excerpt here, it keeps mentioning physicians misrepresenting things. So my instinct here is that it's probably on fraud, maybe is related to medical malpractice. So for now, at least, let's keep scrolling and to see what else we've got. Next, we have a bunch of research references, and we've discussed how these can be pretty useful to find other sources using a legal encyclopedia, but they're really not something we would specifically search for in the way that we just did now. It's more of something that we would use once we've actually found the part of the source that's relevant or helpful to us. So scrolling down a little bit further, our 12th result here, this does look better. Words like generally are really a good sign that the source is geared towards giving you an overview. And of course, here, the elements as well are usually pretty helpful in preliminary analysis, another good sign. And when we go ahead and open it up, I'm just going to open it in a new tab. See that we actually do get a pretty meaty discussion of fraud, and it's in our chapter on fraud, which is a pretty good sign as well. And we start here with some kind of general discussion that really emphasizes the rather protean or ambiguous quality of the tort of fraud. Now, one nice feature of Georgia jurisprudence are these boxes here that highlight different concepts and give us various little tips that can be really helpful for us. Here it highlights the idea that a matter that's equally open to the observation of the parties doesn't usually support a fraud claim. And their example of this here is a contract, a written contract. And that seems like it might be bad news for Juanita, so we would probably want to note that in our research plan as we read over this overview. Now, a little bit further down, we get the 5 elements of fraud. And we'll be coming back to these a little bit later in this problem. Okay, so let's see if we can find a good treatise. Now, Georgia does tend to be a jurisdiction where most of the big treatises do happen to be on Westlaw, so I'm just going to stick with it for the rest of this problem. Let's just go back to our front page here by clicking on Westlaw Edge, and we'll choose Secondary Sources. And then we'll narrow it to our Georgia sources. And we'll look at our filters over on our sidebar here. And we'll choose publication type and narrow it to text and treatises. And we know we want a treatise on the subject of torts, so we'll choose the topic of torts and personal injury and narrow it just a little bit further. And that leaves us with just 9 sources, which is fairly manageable, I think. And we know that we're unlikely to find something that would be really wholly focused on fraud in the state of Georgia. So finding a treatise that's focused on Georgia torts in general is really probably going to be our best bet. And looking over these, our only real candidate is going to be the Georgia Law of Torts here. With the others just being a little more specialized, dealing with premises liability in particular, medical torts, products liability. Nothing that's really about torts generally, except for Georgia Law of Torts. Now let's look at our scope note just to see what Georgia Law of Torts is all about. And it says it's a comprehensive treatise on substantive Georgia tort law. That sounds ideal for what we want. So let's go ahead and check it out. Here we've got the table of contents for the treatise. And there are plenty of ways that you could use this to locate the relevant material. But Let's try out our indents so you can have a better sense of how that works in your research process. And of course, it's right over here in your right sidebar under Tools and Resources, where you're always going to find the indents. And we will just run a search of the indents for fraud. And our first result here, the index entry for fraud and misrepresentation, actually looks pretty good. And this is going to give us everywhere in the treatise that fraud comes up. And I'll open it up to show you. And browsing through all of these different entries, we see this entry on fraud generally. And of course, as we just discussed in regards to our legal encyclopedia, when we see generally, we want to think overview. And here for fraud generally, Georgia Law of Torts is going to have this range of sections from 11.1 to 11.9, and we'll just start with the first section. And the title of this section, Fraud Generally, just lets us know that we're learning about those general characteristics of fraud, which is exactly what we want. And we start here pretty similarly to what we saw in Georgia jurisprudence with a discussion of this somewhat amorphous quality that fraud has. And then we move on to a pretty nuanced, a pretty sophisticated discussion of the difference between actual fraud and constructive fraud, along with a treatment of the differing elements of each. This all seems to me to be pretty useful. Now, question 4C asks us for some of the differences between the treatise and the legal encyclopedia. Now, in this case, I think they're actually quite similar because Georgia jurisprudence covers this topic with a fair amount of depth. Now, don't get me wrong, the treatise is still a bit more nuanced and includes more analysis than Georgia jurisprudence. It also gives more space right up front to discussing this distinction between actual fraud and constructive fraud, whereas Georgia jurisprudence is going to put most of that into separate sections a little bit later on. Now, as far as how you would use these sources, I think they would really complement and reinforce one another. Now, the way that Georgia jurisprudence is organized into so many different subchapters and sections could help to make it easier to find exactly what we want very quickly. That structure also might aid us in identifying related issues, since we could just browse through all of those different headings in the table of contents to get an idea of the issues that tend to come up. On the other hand, Georgia Law of Torts has this really nice quality to its overall discussion. It's somewhat scholarly, but it remains pretty accessible. Overall, it's definitely going to give you more analysis and more context, and it does contain some insights which would probably be more helpful if you were, say, like a seasoned torts lawyer than what you would find in Georgia jurisprudence. But it would also, at the same time, do a great job of building on that overview that we find in Georgia jurisprudence. But of course, this was a fairly open question, so don't be surprised if your answer here was pretty different from mine. The important thing is that you're really digging in and that you're thinking about what these sources contain and how you would actually use them. Now, for question 5 here, we need to find the elements of fraud. And at first glance, I think this is relatively simple, since the sections that we found in Georgia Law of Torts and Georgia jurisprudence list out our elements. And if you just went to one of those sections that we found and pulled out the elements from one of the sources, that's totally fine. But let's take a closer look at those elements in Georgia Law of Torts, because I do think a more attentive reading of these sources is going to help you realize that fraud really is somewhat amorphous and that its elements can differ quite a bit based on what type of fraud you're pursuing. So if we were using our treatise here for our elements, we would probably want to note here that actual fraud based upon an omission or concealment is a little bit different. The elements change somewhat because the reliance of your plaintiff must be on the omission, and there needs to be either partial disclosure or a duty to disclose the material fact that was omitted. And similarly, constructive fraud could be a better fit for our fact pattern, since we don't know anything about the intent of the defendants or their possible state of mind. So we might want to note in our planning documents that it doesn't require actual knowledge of falsity, and it can be based upon an unintentional representation. Now, of course, this does tend to make our elements here somewhat messier than we might prefer, but that's life. If we were really researching this, we would probably want to actually try to figure out a way to synthesize these elements in a cleaner way, maybe with reference to how the case law describes constructive fraud, or perhaps how our other secondary sources might describe the elements of constructive fraud. Now, moving on to 5C, we just need to know the types of primary sources that these secondary sources cite for our elements. And of course, you can just look at the footnotes for these primary sources. We can see that we have a statute, we have several cases, and I think that Georgia jurisprudence doesn't specifically mention the statute when it's framing the different elements, so you would want to make sure that you do carefully browse those footnotes to find that statute, because you would need that primary source in your research, even if it's not something you're tying to the elements directly necessarily. Now, these remaining questions are all pretty analytical in nature, so it's quite natural that your answers for these especially are going to vary quite a bit from mine. On question 6, we want to know which element of fraud is going to be the most challenging or the most likely to be contested. And you might have answered with perhaps scienter or knowledge of falsity, perhaps, but I tend to think it's probably justifiable reliance. Because depending on the variety of fraud that we ultimately pursue, if we chose like constructive fraud, we may be able to eliminate some of the obstacles that are posed by intent and posed by knowledge. But the fact that Juanita apparently did not read the contract could make it a challenge to really justify her reliance on the agent's concealments. For question 7, what did we learn that would be helpful in organizing our research going forward? I tend to think it's this notion of constructive fraud as a separate type of fraud claim. We don't need any evidence with that type of claim that Peachtree Partners intended to defraud us, so it might be a better fit for our facts. However, we do want to note that it does limit some of our options for relief. Now, as far as organization, I would probably go ahead and rope off my research into constructive fraud and look into it as a sort of separate issue. And then question 8 really ties into question 7. I personally was pretty confused by the way these secondary sources discussed constructive fraud. The elements were just not laid out quite as clearly as maybe I would prefer. So I would probably want to find an easier to understand discussion of that. 8B, which sources would I use to find that easier to understand discussion? Well, I'd probably at least start just by taking a look at Georgia jurisprudence and seeing what it has to say in its section on constructive fraud. Question 8C asks what else I would want to know, and here I was really asking for any additional factual information that you might want, but I should have been more clear in the way I phrased the question. I think the biggest hole in our facts, our biggest hole in our factual information, really relates to whether the leasing agent knew or didn't know about the fact that the promo didn't apply to that penthouse unit. If he knew, we might actually have a case for actual fraud. But if he didn't know, it seems like we would need to pursue the constructive fraud route. And this information, if we could get it, would really help us to know what to emphasize in our research and sort of how to go about it and how to plan it. So, all right, that is the end of the week 4 assignment. This one was especially open-ended, particularly with these last few questions. So try to focus less on the particular answers that I came up with and more on how I got to those answers and how my thought process worked there. As always, please do let me know if you have any questions. And that's all I have for now. Until next time.